Hello and welcome back. Today we celebrate the fifth Sunday of the year in Ordinary Time, and we have three readings today, one from the prophet Isaiah, one from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, and the Gospel of Luke. And at the heart of particularly the prophet Isaiah and Luke is this idea of call and grace and the fear, actually, that goes along with this encounter with God, who calls us to be his prophet, or to be his messenger, or to be his instrument of grace. And so we see in that amazing image from the prophet Isaiah that he has this vision of God, and when he realizes who he's in the presence of, he's terrified. He recognizes his own wretched state of sin, his unworthiness to be in the presence of the living God. And it is there that God calls him, even though he's imperfect, even though he's not ready, he calls him to be his prophet. But it's a call that involves transformation, purification, and hence we have the image of the seraph bringing the live coal and touching the lips of the prophet Isaiah. Now you think about that image for a minute. God is purifying him of his sin, making him ready for what he's been called to do. But having a live coal touching your lips is not a pleasant image or a pleasant experience. So purification does involve in our lives some form of struggle or even pain as we seek to say no to those dark aspects of ourselves, those desires that are not life-giving, and to say yes to the will of God in our lives. This is purgatory, if you like, or purification. And it's part of our life as Christians as we answer the call of God. And so once Isaiah is purified, he's more open. He actually even offers himself to be the one that God will send. He's more open to the will of God in his life. And it's the same for us too. The more we seek to purify ourselves, the more we seek to align ourselves with God, the more open we become to his will and to what he is calling us to be. And it's all about grace. You know, it is God's initiative in us. He graces us with his presence. He graces us with the strength to change. He sanctifies us for eternal life. In the second letter, or in the second reading, the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians, we see really grace working again. This time it's in the context of the gospel that Paul teaches, and the gospel is grace. The gospel is the great gift that God has given us in Jesus Christ. And that's why it's so important, as St. Paul reminds us, that we must believe in the gospel that has been taught to us by the apostles, not to believe in anything that's an aberration or an addition or a reduction of what the apostles have taught us. Otherwise, it comes to nothing. And this has been a challenge in society since the beginning of the church, and it's certainly a challenge in our world today. Ultimately, it comes down to, as Christians, we're called to conform ourselves to the teaching of Christ, not the other way around. It's our society often, and even individuals, we want to be followers of Christ, but we want Christ to be conformed to our desires. We want to rationalize what we want and make it God's will. But that's not the way. And that's what Paul is talking about. He says that, the gospel that you received and in which you are firmly established, believe in that gospel and that gospel alone, because the gospel will save you only if you keep believing exactly what I preach to you. Believing anything else will not lead to anything, because this is the grace that God gives us. Paul goes on to remind us again that, he is not an apostle by his own worthiness. In fact, he states that he is the least worthy. He is an apostle by the grace of God, by the call of God, even though he's unworthy. And this is the theme that comes through again in the gospel, that God calls us even though we're not perfect. And so we can never have the excuse of saying, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to say, I'm not educated enough, I'm not good enough. When God calls us, God calls us. And we see this again in the Gospel of Luke. In the Gospel of Luke, we have the story of Jesus calling his first disciples. In this case, it's Simon, who will become Peter, and the sons of Zebedee, James and John. And we see that Simon and his companions have been out fishing all night, and they've caught nothing. Jesus on the shore says to them, "Put out into the deep water again and put your nets out for another catch." And even though Peter, it's kind of clear from the text, is skeptical about this because he's been working hard all night, he does it anyway. And it's because he's listened to the Lord and been obedient to what he's been commanded to, that now he brings in a huge amount of fish, so big that the boat is going to sink. So again, we see the action of grace in our lives. It's the initiative of God, of Christ calling us. This is the action of grace. And this should also caution us. Grace is not magic. Rather, grace is an invitation. It's an invitation to enter into communion with Christ. Grace needs to be responded to. That's our work. It's a gift. And like any gift, it can be received or rejected. So grace is an initiative of Christ, responded to by us, and the results flowing from grace, or flowing from our response to the grace that's been given us. This is the life of the disciple, a life of grace. So without Christ, we see what happens. Simon and his companions have been out all night trying to fish. Christ has not been present. No matter how hard they work, they catch nothing. And so it is with us too. Without the grace of Christ, no matter how hard we work, no matter how good the intentions, our results will be negative because we are people of grace. We see another aspect too, that once Peter understands, or Simon Peter understands who it is that he's interacting with here, he has the same kind of reaction as Isaiah in the first reading. It's fear. And so he gets down on the ground and he doesn't dare to look at Jesus. He falls on his knees and he says, "Leave me, Lord, I am a sinful man." Because both Simon Peter and Isaiah are very conscious of the fact that a human being a sinful person, cannot be in the presence of God and live. And so they're afraid. But Jesus says, "Don't be afraid. I have come to heal you and to call you and for you to be my disciple and my instrument to bring other people to you, to us as well." So grace, again, overcomes fear. It overcomes that fear of not knowing what to do, of not being good enough, of not being able to fulfill what God has called us to, the fear even of God himself. Grace overcomes fear and sends us on mission. So grace replaces fear with, if you like, obedience, awe, and ultimately agape, love. And so Simon and his companions and James and John, they all immediately leave everything and they follow him because they know who he is. So what is the grace of Christ inviting you to? How are you being invited and challenged in your own life to enter into a deeper relationship with Christ and his church? How will you answer that question? And what are the things in your life that perhaps bring you fear and stop you? It might be your desires, it might be the reaction of others. What is it that stops you being a full-on Christian? To really be a disciple who follows the Lord. Perhaps that's what we can reflect on as we look at these readings at Mass this weekend and during the week. Let us remember then that we are graced by God and that his call to us, his gift of grace, it's all his initiative. He calls out to us. He reaches out to you and to me. And he invites you and he invites me to greater life, and to a life where we cooperate with him in calling others into this great life of sharing in the death and resurrection of Christ. May God bless you.